would like to set the scene, if you like, for this session by talking about the present, the future, and the past. And so why that order? I think we're caught in the present, so I'd like to speak to those dynamics first. The future, because the title of this session, as Jean-Marc just mentioned, is what is next. So we're all wondering and preoccupied by where this is going. And I'm going to end with the past, because there's a risk that we go back to the same ways of doing things. And there's an opportunity, of course, that we don't do that. I did take a very loose inspiration for the structure of this presentation in the short amount of time I have from Sohail Inayatullah's Futures Triangle. So I'm going to speak first to the push of the present. So we're caught up in today's dynamics, understandably. We want to return to our day-to-day lives. And there's an uncertainty and unknown also for the broader implications. It's an evolving and adapting situation, but I'm just going to highlight from the present context, so from the near term, what are some of those international security implications to start us off? And then I'll move on to the future. So first, from a governance side, very fundamentally, this is a health crisis. So it's affecting government services either directly with their own health, and we've seen a number of leaders affected, or more indirectly. So the functioning or reduced functioning maybe of civil services. Related to this is parliaments, for instance, that maybe are not meeting, or debates are postponed, elections, and that could lead to some public frustration. I really want to underline this is very limited this far, but of course it's important to address the scenarios if that's not the case. Secondly, the contacts between countries. This is so important on sensitive issues in international security for this relationship building, for the in-person meetings. And so many meetings we see are postponed and rescheduled. And there's a concern if there's this back and forth between a prolonged quarantine period and then an easing of those measures, this could impede a return to normal functioning for some time. So that's something also to watch out for. There's an increase in existing tensions. So there might be new tensions created, but it's more likely that we're exacerbating existing ones. And Matt Burrows is going to speak more to that later on. So I'm going to just leave it there, but just underline that this is particularly acute in fragile contexts. So in those countries experiencing conflict now, or in those post-conflict instances. So that's already we see some action happening, but it's important to watch that over the coming weeks and months. It's always regrettable that sometimes a crisis can be a catalyst to escape maybe a deadly situation. And we've seen here already the UN Secretary General call for a global ceasefire. So that's also wanted to mention that opportunity in that sense. The next on the fourth on the list is disinformation. Of course, technology is playing an important role used for a lot of good in this crisis. But there's also this potential for the misuse. So it could be used, disinformation by this pandemic, they use for malicious actors for gain. So they might wish to exaggerate the impact or bring attention to some inadequate response efforts or assign blame. So that's something as well to look out for. And of course, going forward regarding the tracking of this virus on an individual level and individual privacy and surveillance concerns. There's other issues being neglected that need attention and action. So the focus on COVID and this immediate response can't be faulted, no doubt. But the other issues continue. I think when we see the virus arriving in places like Yemen right now, and also we see that maybe the high level attention and momentum on other global issues such as climate change, we need to make sure that those continue. So I think this recent call for this green recovery, we'll see if that catches on, but it's important to keep an eye on that. On a practical side, still on this, we still haven't worked fully out how virtual meetings can take place when voting is required, and it might be a slower decision making at that level. I think overall, and just to end on this slide, as we progress in this crisis, it's really interesting to watch out for how this situation is changing our society's ways of operating, but then a step further, how this may impact the international security sphere. So might we see new ways of seeing and reacting to existing situations, or innovative forms of exchanging, and that could be potentially exciting. Second, on the future. So the pull of the future, and what is the contribution of strategic foresight? So not the future in the sense of the crisis preparedness, but really a step further on how we can do better at anticipation, which is really also the topic of this session. So in UN speak, they're talking about building back better. So how can we harness this moment to help countries become stronger in the future? And how can strategic foresight contribute to that? First, the interlinked time horizon. And I think Brigadier General is going to speak to this. I'll be quite brief here. But it's often important to distinguish between different timeframes and to give the space, for instance, to think about the future. But you can't always put each of those into their separate categories. So there's a need to also think about how they intermingle. Second, surprise and shock. There's been a huge human toll, which Jean-Marc mentioned, and the global breadth of the COVID-19 has all kind of startled us. This might be an opening to look at the possibility of other developments, and that could be beyond global health, a future surprise and shock in different areas, very different areas. Thirdly here, the structured approach. So COVID-19 reminds us about uncertainty in our lives and many questions that we ask about how this pandemic might evolve. And the future is fundamentally uncertain. So the foresight approach is uniquely placed to help us manage that uncertainty. And of course, there's different processes and methods that can be used to help us with that uncertainty. And lastly, and I think this is really from an international security perspective, the blurred boundaries. We all know that threats don't respect geographical boundaries, and they don't respect disciplinary boundaries as well. In global health, of course, COVID's an example of this. But here we can also find some support in foresight to help us broaden our perspectives on with various means that we have available in this discipline. So understand also how those factors may interact as well. So next on the past, and I'm ending with the past, not the crisis barriers, and there's a number of barriers in the crisis that we can obviously speak to, and there's many of those, but barriers in terms of strategic foresight. And this is my concluding point and slide. And I want to refer to this question that I've put up there, and that's just a reflection question for the audience, to say that thinking about the future is not a luxury, and it's often sort of put in that category on the practical side, whereby thinking about the future is relegated to that strategic planning cycle with a very fixed and limited time frame. We want to move the future out of that category. And I want to just point to two shifts that can maybe help this. And then I'll end on this point. So the first shift is about the policymakers. So it's a shift from overemphasis on this day-to-day management to more anticipatory and adaptable planning. And that means obviously very hard implications in terms of priority setting and resource allocations. And I don't want to paint over that this is a new problem. This is a long-standing problem. And I just want to quote Thomas Schelling here, where he said in the early 60s, there is a tendency in our planning to confuse the unfamiliar with the improbable. So we need to spend more time on thinking about these unfamiliar threats. That could be the big ones, the catastrophic risk, the existential risks, or it could just be a fresh look at some of the other issues that appeared alongside pandemics in recent reports. Secondly, and lastly, at the same time, strategic foresight processes need to do even better into exploring creatively alternative futures and the space to do that, but then making that connection to policy action that can be taken today, and that can be small or large. And we're going to hear more about that here. So I'm going to end here, and I look forward to the discussion, so thank you.